Some people say a man is made out of mud. A poor man's made out of muscle and blood. Muscle and blood and skin and bones. A mind that's weak and a back that's strong. You load 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store.
Child labor protection laws, the 8-hour workday, higher wages, and the right to join a union. Socialism. Martin Luther King Jr., Albert Einstein, Helen Keller, Mark Twain. Socialists. All right. The crowd footage was a little dramatic on my side of things. I mean, most people today are probably willing to admit that the Red Scare of 1917 or McCarthyism during the Cold War were bad things. In fact, there's a lot of articles in mainstream media and academia written about just how bad it was. So I guess it's okay to say we'll never fall into that kind of trap again, right?
That America will never be a socialist country.
Other countries tried that. It was called communism, and it just didn't work.
60 plus years of socialist tyranny.
Communism is a failed system.
Right? On the contrary, I'm willing to argue that we never actually found our way out of that trap to begin with, and now just simply exist within a space of permanent anti-socialist propaganda. And instead of the past instances being political or cultural trends, we've just kind of shifted our collective consciousness to accept anti-socialist or anti-communist propaganda as fact, keeping us forever trapped in this era of blatant misinformation, which allows the United States to lie about developing countries and meddle in their affairs, and political repression around anything perceived as socialist. And one should ask, how can this deep fondness for American icons who were socialist, or at least held socialist beliefs, and our celebration of the rights that we enjoy today as workers and citizens of the United States that were earned by movements that were socialist in their nature, can exist next to this overwhelmingly visceral reaction to even the utterance of a word about socialism? The answer to that mystery is somehow both obvious and obscure. The socio-political phenomenon that has implanted such a strong cognitive dissonance in Americans' minds today has several names: the Red Scare, McCarthyism, Anti-Communism, and Anti-Socialism. And for this video specifically, we're going to be using the last term given, anti-socialism, as I feel is the least pinned down contextually out of the list of available terms. But before we get into the history of anti-socialist rhetoric in the United States, we're going to have to start off by defining some terms, because in a cruel twist of irony, some of these terms have been loaded with decades of the same misinformation that I'm making this video about today in 2024. Socialism is a political organization of society in which workers have collective ownership over the means of production, i.e., the tools, materials, and places in which they perform labor. Private ownership by a CEO or board of executives over the means of production is cast aside, and the concept of democratic participation is extended to the laborers of the workplace to make decisions based on their collective needs. There is no longer the extraction of wealth generated by the workers' labor power being transferred upward. Therefore, the profit incentive is made obsolete as the main factor of decision-making. In this society, the state is used to ensure this transition of the mode of production, and elected officials are paid a working man's wage and subject to recall by voters at any point should they fail to deliver on the demands of the working class. Anti-socialism is an American political and cultural phenomenon, one that deploys a combination of cultural denunciation through massive disinformation campaigns launched by privately owned media companies, often working in tandem with the state, as well as the political repression of socialists through the criminalization of socialist political activity. And unfortunately, this presents us with another question. How do we know what the proponents of anti-socialist values would identify as socialist or communist political activity? To begin that process, we have to go back to the first iteration of anti-socialist rhetoric in the United States that we'll be analyzing in this video today, the Red Scare of 1917.
Got a union contract that keeps the worker free, and I'll never shoot that union out of me.
Contrary to our current attitudes about socialism, the turn of the 20th century was accompanied by a huge influx of workers' organizations, many of which were explicitly socialist. During this time, the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW, found themselves gaining popularity both amongst American and migrant workers, with their point of production labor militancy approach to advocating for things like workers' rights and political power. This national uplifting of workers' class consciousness was accompanied by the development of communist movements throughout Europe as well, as best shown by the first successful socialist revolution in history, the October Revolution of 1917, in which organized socialists led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik Party seized control of the Russian state, proving that masses of workers were capable of organizing themselves and realizing political self-determination. And while this was certainly met with enthusiasm by workers' organizations in the United States, as well as across the globe, it served as the final catalyst for the American Red Scare. The beginning of this reaction was a series of raids on IWW members where some 200 members of the union were arrested and imprisoned, the majority of which were tried through mass trials in 1918 and 1919 on the charges of sabotaging the war effort for the First World War in favor of imperialist Germany, an accusation that is now widely understood to be completely untrue. The peak of the first iteration of America's Red Scare politics came in late 1919 when federal agents and local police conducted a series of raids over the course of 3 months, leading to the arrest and prosecution or deportation of hundreds of workers who were suspected communists. Some were and some weren't. These raids are referred to as the Palmer Raids, after Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, a staunch anti-communist who oversaw the operation on the federal level. Scholars believe that these raids were targeted at specific union leadership and organized socialists who were advocating for things like higher pay, shorter workdays, and safer working conditions under the pretext of anti-American sabotage and espionage. Now we have an understanding of who exactly found themselves targeted during the first iteration of anti-socialism in America. Anyone who was involved in socialist or communist political parties that were allowed to exist in the States up until that point. Union members or labor rights advocates, immigrants from countries we didn't like, or anti-war activists all received the brand of anti-American saboteur and suspected communists and could be persecuted as such. Arguably the most defining feature of post-World War II American society and politics is the second and most infamous form of anti-socialism in American history, dubbed McCarthyism after Senator Joe McCarthy. And while we've seen that this anti-socialistic induced hysteria existed long before him, McCarthy became the face of its second form, and although it was not a new phenomenon, it was certainly given renewed vigor and its influence was remarkably expanded, the consequences of which are still felt to this day.
We've got to do something, yeah, to save the children.
Step right up, folks. Here's the answer to your problems. Dr. Utopia's sensational new discovery, ISM.
I hereby turn over to ISM Incorporated everything I have, including my freedom and the freedom of my children and my children's children, in return for which said ISM promises to take care of me forever. Ah, yes, the Union. Welcome to our ranks, number 1313. No more private property, no more you. Farmers don't vote anymore.
What'll they do for seed next year?
You won't have to worry about next year.
We must fight to regain our freedom, or everything is lost. Everything
is fine. Everything is fine.
Under the pretext of combating the rise of communism in Europe, far-right forces in American politics began their witch hunt to find Soviet agents operating within our own borders, which led to accusations being hurled in every direction. Some of these accusations led to convictions, however most did not. Regardless, Americans everywhere were filled with paranoia that their neighbors were secretly Soviet spies. Your coworker complain about his pay? Communist. Did one of little Timmy's classmates share his lunch with him? Communist. Some people performing a play written in the times of ancient Greece? Communists. That last one actually happened, by the way.
You don't seriously think you're going to get Americans to go communist, do you? Not with all those benefits you've been handing out. You want to know something, Judge? You and all your commie friends can go plumb to blazes.
Senator sentenced to death. Sentence will be carried out at the time and place to be...
These accusations extended beyond individual citizens to government officials or even whole departments of the federal government who in some way just didn't seem American enough. Committees like the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigation and the House Un-American Affairs Committee were formed by the government and funded by the American taxpayers to stop the communist menace from further infiltrating our democracy. Millions of government employees were made to fill out loyalty investigation forms, resulting in 500 to 600 workers either being fired or not even hired to begin with. Labor unions and their leadership, who were starting to rebuild after the destruction caused by the first Red Scare, were systematically targeted and crippled again, leaving the American workers once again defenseless against increasing exploitation. Hollywood screenwriters and filmmakers were blacklisted from the industry and sometimes jailed on contempt of Congress charges when they pushed back against political censorship. Homosexuality was illogically linked to the communist threat, leading to the increased repression of anyone outed as not heterosexual. And black civil rights advocates were targeted as un-American and suspected communists when they advocated against Jim Crow-era segregation. However difficult it was before to advocate for things like civil rights or workers' protections, it became nearly impossible to do so without facing serious consequences during this time. To pick one example of political oppression during this second phase of the anti-socialist reaction, it's like looking for a needle within a stack of needles, within a city of needles, within like a state. But one person's story has always stuck out to me as a perfect illustration of the state-sanctioned insanity of the time. The story of a talented and brave man who never sacrificed his principles even in the face of the state apparatus of the largest empire in the history of the world. His name was Paul Robeson, an American actor, playwright, singer, civil rights activist, and Marxist. He faced racial discrimination at every corner throughout his life, no doubt fueling his political radicalization, which came full circle in his travels abroad studying and working in theater, during which he received an invitation to go visit the Soviet Union. I could quote his thoughts on his trip to Moscow, but I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to do him justice, as he was an incredible writer, but an even more talented speaker. But luckily for us, I don't have to, because in 1956, Paul Robeson was summoned to testify before the House Un-American Affairs Committee after publicly declaring that African Americans would play no part in America's imperialist wars. At this hearing, despite the empty rhetoric, petty nonsense, and gross accusations being lobbed from the congressman who summoned him, Mr. Robeson still managed to deliver an incredibly powerful speech, the transcript for which has been reenacted by none other than James Earl Jones.
Are you now a member of the Communist Party?
Oh, please, please, please.
Please answer, will you, Mr. Robeson?
What is the Communist Party? What do you mean by that?
You are directed to answer, Mr. Robeson.
In the first place, wherever I have been in the world, the first to die in the struggle against fascism were the communists. I laid many wreaths upon the graves of communists. That is not criminal. You are the author of the bills that are going to keep all kinds of decent people out of the country.
No, only your kind.
Colored people like myself. And you would let in the Teutonic Anglo-Saxon stock.
We are trying to make it easier to get rid of your kind, too.
You don't want any colored people to come in.
It would be a revelation if you would listen to counsel.
In good company, I usually listen. But you know, people wander around in such fancy places.
Did you write an article that was published in the USSR Information Bulletin?
Yes.
Quote, I want to emphasize that only here in the Soviet Union did I feel that I was a real man with a capital M, close quote.
Let us not go so
It is
far
important to
afield.
explain this.
Did you make that statement?
When I first went to Russia in 1934...
Did you make that
When
statement?
I first went to Russia in
Did you
1934...
make that statement?
In Russia, I felt for the first time like a full human being. No color prejudice like in Mississippi. No color prejudice like in Washington. It was the first time I felt like a human being.
Why do you not stay in Russia?
Because my father was a slave, and my people died to build this country. And I'm going to stay here and have a part of it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?
You are here because you are promoting the communist cause.
I am here because I'm opposing the neo-fascist cause, which I see arising in these committees. And I won't argue with a representative of the people who, in building America, wasted the lives of my people. You are responsible, you and your forebears, for 60 to 100 million black people dying in the slave ships and on the plantations. Don't you ask me about anybody.
I'm sure you wouldn't want to discuss with us the slave labor camps in the
Nothing
Soviet
could build
Union.
more on slavery than this society, I assure you.
Formerly communist councilman in New York. Do you know Ben
One
Davis?
of my dearest friends, he is as patriotic an American as can be, and you, gentlemen, are the non-patriots.
Just a minute.
You are the un-American.
The hearing is now adjourned.
I think it should be.
I've endured all of this that I can.
Can I read my statement?
No! The meeting is adjourned.
It should be.
Paul Robeson may be a great example of a forgotten American socialist. However, he's hardly the only one. It is a great injustice that in our early education experience here in the States, we're taught so much about the feats accomplished by these American icons while learning next to nothing about their political ideologies. The long list of whitewashed American socialists or Americans who are more socialistic in their beliefs, be it through anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist ideals, includes people like Malcolm X, Helen Keller, Albert Einstein, John Steinbeck, Ernest Hemingway, Orson Welles, and Mark Twain, just to name a few. But the most dramatic and blatant example of our system's whitewashing of American socialists is the story of civil rights icon Martin Luther King Jr. The political legacy of the Reverend is something that every politician and political institution in the United States claim to honor and champion. Democrats use his peaceful philosophy and socially progressive worldview to contribute to their ethos, and Republicans use his critique of liberals to do the same. Both parties are eager to co-opt and degrade his legacy in the most egregious ways possible. The reason we only hear the same 3 quotes mostly from Dr. King is because he openly and often pushed back against capitalism and even self-identified as a socialist. So to help broaden our understanding of his politics, here are 2 quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. that you probably haven't heard before. In a letter to his wife Coretta Scott, who was then his girlfriend, in July 18, 1952, King writes, I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. Capitalism started out with a high and noble motive, but like most human systems, it fell victim to the very thing it was revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. And in a report to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference staff in May 1967, King said, we must recognize that we can't solve our problem now until there's a radical redistribution of economic and political power. This means a revolution of values and other things. We must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You can't really get rid of one without getting rid of the others. The whole structure of American life must be changed. America is a hypocritical nation, and we must put our own house in order. This is a great example of the lasting effects of McCarthyism in the realm of education, but it hardly ends there. Since our political institutions, media, both news and entertainment, and workplace cultures have become so deeply intertwined with the profit motive, anti-socialist narratives serve as a useful tool to ensure that workers' organizing is always seen as something that is taboo. Now, after analyzing both the Red Scare and McCarthyism, we have an answer to our question we asked at the beginning of the video: what does the establishment define as socialist or communist political activity? Anyone who's a self-proclaimed socialist or communist, which, fair. Union members or labor unions in their entirety, black civil rights advocates, LGBTQ plus advocates, immigrants, anyone who criticizes America or capitalism in general, and even inconvenient political opponents that need to be pushed out.
The mayor's a cop, the blues quadrupled up, the block is high. Shit, this how they chose to use the guap.
This brings us to the present era of anti-socialism in the United States, a time where we are more disconnected from our political system than ever, with the internet seemingly keeping us ahead of the cultural tactics that made McCarthyism so successful. And while there is some truth that the younger generations, like millennials or Gen Z, have a healthy skepticism towards the more traditional forms of propaganda, it is equally true that this breeds a certain amount of arrogance within us that leaves us susceptible to the modern form of anti-socialist agitation. In my research, I came across an article entitled McCarthy and McCarthyism, written by an American socialist named James Folk in 1954. This article is packed with amazing analysis written from the socialist perspective at the height of the Cold War Red Scare. While describing how McCarthyism wasn't quite fascistic in its nature, he notes potentially what it could become in the future, which can now be read as a brilliant yet chillingly accurate analysis of what we are now observing in modern American political rhetoric. He writes, "While we fail to see wherein McCarthyism can be equated to fascism, we would be guilty of an ostrich-like self-deception not to recognize the seeds of an authoritarian movement in it. More than that, we should not exclude the long-range possibility of this authoritarian movement coming to power, either through a successful struggle for the control of the Republican Party, or failing that, through a consolidation of the forces of total McCarthyism in some new alignment of political parties. With the decline of U.S. global economic hegemony weakening our ability to export poverty to the global South, we are seeing the American workers become poorer and poorer, and the dream of a white picket fence, dog, and 2.5 kids is getting further and further away. So naturally, these workers are looking for answers outside of the traditional nuclear American dream. People are finding those answers in things like labor unions and community organizations, and with that comes a resurgence of anti-labor and anti-socialist reaction. Through a combination of their complete integration into the American political system during the Cold War and a modernizing of their tactics, the successors of McCarthy and Palmer before him are hard at work in 2024. And to start with the obvious example, here's a clip of 2024 Republican frontrunner and ex-President Donald Trump telling his voter base what is to be done with the Marxists in the United States.
Today, I'm announcing a new plan to protect the integrity of our immigration system. Federal law prohibits the entry of communists and totalitarians into the United States. But my question is, what do we do with the ones that are already here that grew up in it? I think we have to pass a new law for them. Using federal law in Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act, I will order my government to deny entry to all communists and all Marxists. Those who come to and join our country must love our country. We want them to love our country. We don't want them when they want to destroy our country. Welcome to America. We want to destroy your country. Thank you very much. So we're going to keep foreign Christian-hating communists, Marxists, and socialists out of America. We're keeping them out of America.
And here's the less popular Republican in Florida saying the same thing.
Senator Rick Scott here. Let me give you a travel warning. If you're a socialist, communist, somebody that believes in big government, I would think twice. Think twice if you're thinking about taking a vacation or moving to Florida. We're the free state of Florida. We actually don't believe in socialism. We actually know people, and some people in our state lived under it, and we know people lived under socialism. It's not good. It's not good for anybody. So if you're thinking about it, if you think about coming to Florida and you're a socialist or communist, think twice. We like freedom, liberty, capitalism, things like that.
Much like McCarthy's witch hunts, these statements are mostly ceremonial and simply meant to bolster their image in the minds of their voter base. However, the possibility of these things being enforced through authoritarian means only grows stronger the longer it permeates through American politics and people become more impoverished and desperate, which we have been and will continue to. While the modern Republicans' thoughts on socialism are clear, Present unmasked and for all to see, the Democratic Party of the United States plays the role of the wolf in sheep's clothing. Its position to the left of the Republicans allows it to absorb the energy of labor or civil rights movements under the guise of legitimation, meanwhile defanging radicals, co-opting their movements, and rendering them useless as they fundraise and galvanize their voter base off the activist cause. They try to separate themselves aesthetically from their conservative counterparts, but when it comes to domestic labor disputes or foreign policy and instances of socialist projects in developing countries, there is often complete consensus between the two parties. An excellent example of this came in 2022, when Democrats and Republicans alike found themselves opposing the rail workers' union as negotiations on a contract were stalling and a strike became imminent.
In late November 2022, President Joe Biden, the most pro-labor president in the history of the United States, urged Congress to pass a vote that would force rail workers to a tentative agreement with the rail corporations to avoid a national rail strike. The justification for this is that a rail strike would have been too disruptive to the United States' economy, and so the federal government, both Republicans and Democrats, invoked the Railway Labor Act of 1926, which allows Congress to deny certain workers the right to strike under certain circumstances. Around 60,000 workers voted against the agreement that was forced through, which most notably denied the workers' request for 7 days of paid sick leave, leaving them with none. And while yes, a rail strike would have burdened our economy and proved very inconvenient for the many industries that rely on rail transit for materials, we need to remember that that is the point of a strike. And instead of forcing these CEOs or companies to meet the workers' demands, which would avoid a strike, which they could have done, or allowing the workers to go on strike and eventually win, which they also could have done, our elected officials chose to force the workers to either submit to their CEOs or risk an illegal strike. Yes, some Democrats did voice concerns over this legislation. The majority still voted to force it through, ultimately showing their allegiance to capital at the cost of rail workers' safety and dignity.
Throughout this video, we have seen how anti-socialism and the labor movement within the U.S. are linked, and the example we just looked at is proof of its continuation in politics today. Let us now turn to modern anti-socialism and its consequences in the developing world and look at Cuba, a perfect example of the real harm done by America today with its roots in McCarthyist hysteria. Literally 99% of the world is against our treatment of the island nation home to 11 million people. 90 miles from the coast of Florida, Cuba has been under an embargo for over 60 years based on speculative claims that the international community has long recognized as baseless and untrue. In November of this year, the UN voted on a resolution named Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. This most recent vote resulted in 187 countries voting in favor of ending the embargo, while just America and Israel voted against the resolution, with Ukraine abstaining from the vote. This embargo is not symbolic. It presents real consequences for real people. Things like medical supplies, agricultural equipment, and fuel are prevented from being imported into Cuba simply because we do not agree with their economic model. And while some progress was made to normalize relations with Cuba during the Obama administration, a combination of the Trump and Biden administrations have reaffirmed our embargo policy, making it an example of anti-socialist bipartisan cooperation in 2023-2024. How can something be so clear to the rest of the world, yet be seen as complicated or even justifiable in the eyes of Americans today? This is where the groundwork of the anti-socialism of old meets its modern tactics. It's the tandem of both the state and media manufacturing consent for this sort of unpopular foreign policy, and while the rest of the world may see the situation for what it is, the average American may believe the false narrative of Cuba being a totalitarian regime deserving of the imperial stranglehold that they exist in. For decades in the United States, our government and media have been allowed to make baseless, McCarthy-level accusations about Cuba completely unchecked, and out of the many examples, I think the most recent one is the best to look at. In 2020, then President Donald Trump enacted harsher sanctions on Cuba, further worsening the economic situation on the island. The timing could not have been worse for this, as the entire world was soon to be crippled by the COVID-19 pandemic. Cuba, already wounded by an illegal embargo, underwent the task of managing their precarious economic situation while also handling a public health crisis and having to develop their own vaccines. Life on the island was hard. Despite the enormous challenges Cuban doctors and scientists faced, they were able to administer a vaccine for children faster than the United States, as well as sending their vaccine to other countries like Vietnam, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Syria. This feat is another feather in the cap of Cuba's incredible medical system and biotech infrastructure that Castro and the revolutionary government invested $1 billion into back in the 1980s. On top of everything, Cuba has sent and continues to send thousands of doctors to countries throughout the globe to assist with their own public health system. So what was Cuba's reward for their outstanding medical diplomacy during the pandemic? In 2021, the hashtag SOSCuba was trending on Twitter in the United States. A massive, invasive disinformation campaign aimed at fermenting unrest on the island and fooling Americans into calling for humanitarian aid and regime change in Cuba. Like I said previously, between the embargo on essential materials and the global pandemic, life was and still is hard in Cuba. And there are certainly some who would attribute that to the socialist project that started in 1959. However, the amount of Cubans in Cuba who feel that way represent a very, very small minority, which raises the question, how did SOS Cuba create such a brief yet loud call for an end to socialism on the island? Well, after analyst Julio Macias Tovar researched the social media phenomenon, we have an answer to our question. After extensive analysis on the social media activity, it was reported that the vast majority of accounts that tweeted SOS Cuba were created less than a year before, and some 1,500 accounts were created on July 10th and July 11th, with some of those accounts posting at impossible rates of 1,000 tweets in 2 days and 5 retweets per second. These are all telltale signs of targeted misinformation tactics meant to sabotage the revolutionary government of Cuba. This sort of disinformation spread has been a go-to tool for anti-socialist forces for over a century now. Fortunately, it is harder to get that information to stick in the modern day when the majority of the world is not falling in line with our narrative on Cuba. If you sat through the whole video, thank you for watching. I really hope I was able to provide some context to the massive misinformation surrounding socialism here in the States. No matter your feelings about socialism, you gotta admit that this sort of repression is completely antithetical to the United States' stated values of honoring freedom of speech and freedom of expression, or even honoring other people's democratic decisions in countries outside the United States. We should tell the whole story about those Americans who believed in a different social order and not pacify their memory. We should demand that our public officials work on things that would actually benefit our lives instead of hiding behind debunked statistics and dishonest stories about people who wanted to try things differently. We should be allowing workers to organize and advocate for their right to live a better life, and to challenge their boss who, at every corner, seeks to cut costs and increase profits even if the consequences are fatal. We should stop letting our tax money be used to deny other countries their right to self-determination, and instead use it to fix our public infrastructure, schools, and healthcare system. Ultimately, if socialism is truly a system that's destined to fail, if it is an inferior way of organizing society, then we should stop spending an endless amount of money sabotaging socialist projects throughout the globe and propagandizing our people against it. I encourage everyone to continue to engage with members of your community. Join organizations, talk to your coworkers, act with empathy, and to keep an open mind when you're trying to think of solutions to the many problems we face today. And to be wary of anybody who tells you that something different is impossible, and think critically about what they have to gain if the status quo is maintained, and what they stand to lose if other ideas are allowed to develop.
And what does it mean to be a communist? It means to fight and devote yourself to the people. If communists, if we leftists, if we Marxists, if we revolutionaries, if we progressives, if we all we want is to hunger for power, then why do we side with the powerless? Then why don't we toady up to power? And that's what hungering for power is. It's climbing, like the political climbers and careers have done in every country in the world. And we on the left don't do that. We stand out in the rain. We stand out on the picket lines. We put our jobs on the line. We risk our careers. In many cases, we even risk our physical safety and our lives in all sorts of countries. If it's power we want, why do we take such a circuitous route?
If you see me coming, better step aside. A lot of men didn't, a lot of men died. One fist of iron, the other of steel. If the right one don't get you, then the left one will. You load 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store.